I remember the exact moment everything changed between us. Not the build-up, not the weeks of careful glances and words left unsaid, but the precise second when Felix's voice cracked in the darkness and asked for something so simple it shattered everything we'd been pretending. We were sitting on the concrete steps outside Murphy's, the campus bar where half our dorm went to forget about midterms and pretend they were adults. The bass from inside thrummed through the brick walls, muffled laughter spilling out every time someone pushed through the heavy wooden doors. But out here, under the orange glow of the streetlight, the night felt different. Quieter, like the world had pulled back just enough to give us space. Felix sat beside me, close enough that I could smell his cologne mixed with the faint scent of beer and cigarettes that clung to his jacket. His hands were restless, fingers drumming against his knees, then stopping abruptly as if he'd caught himself doing something wrong. He'd been like this all evening, wound tight and brittle, laughing too hard at jokes that weren't funny enough to warrant it. Earlier, inside the bar, someone had made a comment. I can't even remember who it was now. Just another face in the crowd of 20-somethings nursing cheap beer and cheaper wine. They'd seen Felix brush against my shoulder when he leaned in to hear me over the music, seen the way he'd lingered there for a beat too long, and they'd grinned with that particular brand of college humor that cuts deeper than it pretends to. "Why are you two always attached at the hip?" they'd said, eyes bright with mischief and malice. "You sure there's nothing going on there?" Felix had gone rigid beside me. I'd felt it in the sudden tension of his shoulders, the way his laugh came out too sharp, too quick. He'd stepped back from me like I was something dangerous, something that might burn him if he stayed too close. "I'm straight," he'd said, the words tumbling out with practiced ease. "Obviously. Don't start with that garbage." But I'd seen his hand shake when he'd reach for his drink. I'd watched the color drain from his face before he'd forced that smile, bright and false as stage lighting. I'd known Felix long enough to recognize the signs of someone drowning in plain sight. We'd been friends for almost 2 years by then. It had started the way most college friendships do, born from necessity and proximity. We'd been paired for a psychology project freshman year, spent hours in the library researching cognitive dissonance and writing papers that neither of us particularly cared about. But somewhere between late-night coffee runs and debates about Freudian theory, something had shifted. We'd started seeking each other out, finding excuses to spend time together even when we didn't need to. Felix was everything I wasn't. Where I was quiet, he was loud. Where I measure my words, he spoke without thinking. He had this way of filling a room just by walking into it, drawing people toward him like he was some kind of gravitational force. But lately, I'd started to notice the cracks in his performance. The way his smile would slip when he thought no one was looking. The way his laughter sometimes sounded more like a cry for help than genuine amusement. I never pushed. That wasn't who I was, wasn't who I'd ever been. People came to me when they were ready to be heard, when they needed someone who wouldn't judge or pry or demand explanations they weren't prepared to give. I learned early that the best way to help someone was to simply be present, to create space for them to exist without the weight of expectation. But Felix had been testing the boundaries of that space for months now, showing up at my dorm room late at night, claiming he couldn't sleep, lingering after study sessions when everyone else had gone home, finding reasons to walk with me across campus, taking the long way to classes we didn't share. Always careful, always casual, always with some excuse that felt just plausible enough to avoid scrutiny. Tonight had been different, though. After the comment in the bar, after his too quick denial, he grabbed my arm and steered me toward the exit. He needed air, he'd said. Needed to get away from the noise and the crowd and the eyes that seemed to follow us everywhere we went. So here we were, sitting on cold concrete steps, the October wind cutting through our jackets and carrying the smell of dying leaves and distant rain. Felix had been quiet for several minutes now, his restless energy gradually settling into something that felt more like resignation than peace. I could hear him breathing, could see the way his chest rose and fell in the uneven rhythm of someone trying to calm themselves down. The streetlight above us flickered, casting our shadows in stuttering patterns across the pavement. Felix's profile was sharp in the intermittent glow, all angles and tension, his jaw clenched tight enough that I could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin. He was beautiful in that careless way that some people just are, without trying or even seeming to notice. Dark hair that always looked like he'd just run his fingers through it, eyes the color of storm clouds, a mouth that smiled too easily and lied even easier. He turned to look at me then, and I saw something in his expression that I'd never seen before. Vulnerability, raw and unguarded. Fear, hope, all of it tangled together in a way that made my chest tight with something I couldn't name. His voice, when he finally spoke, was barely above a whisper. So quiet I had to lean closer to hear him, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his breath against my ear. Could I? He started, then stopped. Swallowed hard. Tried again. Could I hold your hand? The words hung between us like a confession, heavy with everything he couldn't say and everything I'd been afraid to hope for. Not could we hold hands, not would I mind if he held my hand, but could he? As if it was something he had to ask permission for, something that required my consent, not just physically, but morally, emotionally, existentially. I stared at him, watching the way his throat worked as he swallowed again, the way his fingers curled into fists against his thighs. He wasn't looking at me anymore, couldn't seem to meet my eyes, as if the question had cost him something vital and he had nothing left to spend on maintaining eye contact. The silence stretched between us, filled with the distant sound of traffic and the bass line from inside the bar and the rustle of wind through the trees that lined the street. Felix's breathing had gone shallow, quick, like he was preparing to run, like he was already regretting the question, already building walls to hide behind if I said no. But I could see past the walls now, could see the boy who'd been hiding behind them for so long he'd almost forgotten who he really was. The boy who'd been so afraid of what other people might think that he'd convinced himself he was someone else entirely. The boy who'd just asked me the bravest question of his life and was now waiting for me to either save him or destroy him. I looked at his hands, pale in the streetlight, trembling slightly against the dark fabric of his jeans. Hands that had touched mine 100 times before in passing, in friendship, in moments that could be explained away as accidental or meaningless. But this wouldn't be accidental. This wouldn't be meaningless. This would be a choice, a declaration, a line crossed that we could never uncross. The air between us felt charged, electric with possibility and terror in equal measure. I could feel my own heart beating too fast, could taste copper on my tongue from where I'd bitten it without realizing. Felix was still waiting, still not looking at me, his whole body coiled tight, like a spring about to snap. And in that moment, sitting on those cold steps with the world spinning around us and the weight of his question settling into my bones, I realized that everything we'd been dancing around for months had led to this. This simple request, that wasn't simple at all. This moment of truth that would change everything, no matter how I answered. The streetlight flickered again, and in the brief darkness, I made my choice. I reached for his hand without saying a word. My fingers found his in the darkness, and the moment our skin touched, Felix exhaled like he'd been drowning and had finally found air. His hand was cold, trembling slightly, but he didn't pull away. Instead, he laced our fingers together with a desperation that made my chest ache. We sat there in silence, hands clasped between us, and I felt the entire axis of our friendship shift. Nothing would ever be the same after this. We both knew it. To understand how we'd arrived at this moment, you'd have to know who we were before. Who I was before Felix became the center of every thought I try not to think. I've always been the steady one, the friend people came to when they needed someone to listen without judgment. My roommate used to joke that I was like a human confessional booth, that people could tell me their darkest secrets and somehow feel better about themselves afterward. Maybe it was because I never tried to fix anyone, never offered unsolicited advice, or pushed for explanations they weren't ready to give. I just listened, held space, waited for them to find their own way. My friends at State knew me as Reliable Andre, the one who always showed up on time, who remembered birthdays and deadlines and the small details that made people feel seen. I studied psychology not because I wanted to analyze people, but because I was genuinely curious about what made them tick, what made them hurt, what made them heal. I'd grown up in a house where emotions were discussed like weather patterns, natural and inevitable and nothing to be ashamed of. My parents had taught me early that feelings weren't problems to be solved, but experiences to be acknowledged. Maybe that's why people gravitated toward me, why they felt safe enough to let their guards down. Felix was my opposite in almost every way that mattered. He was the kind of person who announced his presence before he even entered a room. His laugh was too loud, his gestures too broad, his energy so intense it seemed to vibrate in the air around him. He told stories that were half truth and half performance, exaggerating details until they became mythology. He could make a trip to the campus bookstore sound like an adventure worthy of legend. But I'd started to notice things about Felix that I don't think anyone else saw. The way his smile would falter when he thought no one was looking. How his hands would shake slightly when he was trying too hard to be funny. The way he filled every silence with noise, as if quiet spaces were dangerous territory where unwanted thoughts might take root. He lived like someone running from something he refused to name. Always moving, always talking, always performing some version of himself that felt just slightly too bright, too loud, too much. It was exhausting to watch sometimes, this constant performance of being Felix Morrison, campus personality, and certified good time. We'd met during freshman orientation, thrown together in one of those forced bonding exercises that universities love so much. A psychology professor had paired us up for a project on cognitive dissonance, probably thinking our different personalities would create interesting friction in our analysis. She'd been right, though not in the way she'd intended. Where I approached the research methodically, Felix attacked it with chaotic energy, pulling all-nighters in the library and emerging with theories that were half brilliant and half nonsense. We'd spend hours debating Festinger's findings, arguing about the nature of contradiction and how people reconcile conflicting beliefs about themselves. The irony wasn't lost on me now. Our friendship had developed slowly at first. Study sessions that turned into late-night conversations about everything except the things that really mattered. Coffee runs that became walks across campus that became standing outside dorm buildings at midnight, neither of us wanting to be the first to say goodbye. Felix had this way of making ordinary moments feel significant. A Tuesday afternoon in the dining hall became an event when he was there, spinning elaborate stories about the other students and their imagined lives. A boring lecture on statistical analysis became bearable when I could catch his eye across the room and see him fighting back laughter at some private joke. But there were other moments too, quieter ones, times when the performance would slip and I'd catch glimpses of whoever Felix really was underneath all that noise and bravado. Late nights when he'd show up at my door claiming he couldn't sleep, then spend hours sprawled on my floor talking about his hometown and his family and the expectations that seemed to follow him everywhere. He never talked about dating, never mentioned being interested in anyone specific. When our friends would tease him about girls he'd met at parties, he'd laugh it off with practiced ease, deflecting attention with jokes or changing the subject entirely. I'd assumed he was just private about his romantic life, maybe shy beneath all that outward confidence. I've been wrong about a lot of things. Over the past few months, I'd started noticing the way Felix looked at me sometimes when he thought I wasn't paying attention. The way he'd find excuses to touch my shoulder during conversations, let his hand linger a beat too long when passing me something. How he'd position himself just slightly too close during our study sessions, close enough that I could smell his shampoo and feel the warmth radiating from his skin. I'd noticed, but I hadn't let myself think about what it meant. Felix Morrison was straight, obviously. He'd said so himself, many times, with that particular emphasis that made it clear the topic wasn't open for discussion. But now, sitting on these cold steps with his hand in mine, and his breathing finally beginning to steady, I understood that some truths are too heavy to carry alone. Some lies become so exhausting that asking to hold someone's hand feels like the bravest thing you've ever done. The streetlight above us had stopped flickering, casting us both in steady amber light. Felix was looking at our joined hands now, as if he couldn't quite believe they were real. Neither could I. The moment that led us to those steps had started hours earlier, back inside Murphy's, in the haze of cheap beer and Friday night desperation that clung to every college bar like smoke. We'd gone with our usual group, the collection of friends who'd somehow found each other in the chaos of dormitory living and decided they could tolerate each other's company long enough to pretend they were having the college experience they'd seen in movies. Jake and Marcus from down the hall, Sarah from Felix's statistics class, a rotating cast of others who drifted in and out of our social orbit depending on their relationship status and academic workload. Felix had been different that night from the moment we'd walked through Murphy's heavy wooden doors. More animated than usual, his laugh pitched higher, his gestures broader. He'd thrown his arm around Jake's shoulders while telling a story about their economics professor, his voice carrying over the music with that particular quality of someone trying too hard to be heard. I'd watch him from across our claimed corner table, nursing a beer I didn't particularly want and wondering when I'd started cataloging Felix's moods like weather patterns. When I'd started noticing the difference between his genuine laughter and the performance version. When I'd begun to recognize the signs that he was uncomfortable, overcompensating, building walls out of noise and movement. The bar was packed, bodies pressed together in the eternal dance of college social life. Someone had fed the jukebox enough quarters to ensure a steady stream of music that was just loud enough to make conversation feel intimate, just soft enough that you had to lean close to be heard. The air was thick with the smell of spilled beer and cheap cologne, the kind of atmosphere that made everything feel more intense, more significant than it probably was. Felix had been holding court at our table, regaling everyone with an increasingly elaborate story about his encounter with campus security earlier that week. His hands moved as he talked, painting pictures in the air, his eyes bright with the kind of manic energy that I'd learned to recognize as a warning sign. That's when Sarah had made the comment that changed everything. She'd been watching Felix gesture wildly while describing his narrow escape from a parking ticket, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. When he'd reached for his beer, his shoulder had brushed against mine, and he'd stayed there for just a moment too long, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his skin through his shirt. Sarah's eyes had caught the moment, tracked the way Felix had lingered in my space before pulling away. Her smile had shifted, taken on that particular quality of college humor that walks the line between teasing and cruelty. "You two are always attached at the hip," she'd said, her voice carrying that sing-song quality that made it clear she thought she was being clever. "Are you sure there's nothing going on there?" The table had gone quiet for a beat, the kind of silence that feels loaded with possibility and danger. Jake had chuckled nervously. Marcus had suddenly become very interested in the label on his beer bottle. And Felix had gone rigid beside me, his entire body tensing like he'd been struck. The change in him was immediate and terrible. The color drained from his face, his easy smile faltering for just a moment before being replaced by something sharper, more defensive. His laugh, when it came, was too quick, too sharp, cutting through the air like glass. "I'm straight," he'd said, the words tumbling out with practiced ease. "Obviously. Don't start with that garbage." But I've been watching him too closely for too long to miss the signs. The way his hands had started to shake. The way he'd shifted away from me as if I was something dangerous, something that might contaminate him if he stayed too close. The way his voice had taken on that particular tone of someone who was protesting too much, trying too hard to convince not just the table, but himself. Sarah had raised her hands in mock surrender, still smiling that knowing smile. "Just joking," she'd said. "No need to get defensive." But the damage was done. Felix had spent the next hour overcompensating, flirting with every girl who came within 10 feet of our table, his laughter growing louder and more frantic with each interaction. He'd told increasingly outrageous stories, bought round for strangers, anything to draw attention away from that moment of vulnerability when Sarah's words had hit too close to something he wasn't ready to acknowledge. I'd watched it all with a growing sense of recognition and heartbreak. I'd seen this before, in the mirror during high school when my own friends had made similar comments, when I'd felt the weight of expectation and assumption pressing down on me like a physical thing. The desperate need to prove something that shouldn't need proving. The exhausting performance of being someone you're not sure you actually are. As the evening wore on, Felix had grown more manic, more desperate in his attempts to reclaim the narrative Sarah had threatened to expose. He danced with girls whose names he didn't know, bought drinks for anyone who would let him, anything to reinforce the image of Felix Morrison, straight guy, campus personality, definitely not someone who lingered too long in other men's personal space. But I'd seen the cracks forming. The way his smile would slip when he thought no one was looking. The way his eyes would find mine across the crowded bar, holding contact for just a moment too long before he'd force himself to look away. The way his hands would shake slightly when he reached for his drink, as if the very act of maintaining his composure was requiring more energy than he had to spare. When he'd finally grabbed my arm and steered me toward the exit, claiming he needed air, I'd felt both relief and dread in equal measure. Relief that he was finally allowing himself to step away from the performance. Dread, because I knew what came next, knew that whatever had been building between us for months was about to reach some kind of breaking point. And now here we were, hands clasped in the amber light of the street lamp, the question that had been hanging between us finally spoken aloud. The bravest 4 words Felix had ever said, carrying the weight of everything he'd been too afraid to acknowledge. Could I hold your hand? That first night, holding hands on the steps outside Murphy's, we stayed until the bar closed and the last stragglers stumbled out into the street, their laughter echoing off the buildings before fading into the distance. Felix's grip on my hand never loosened. If anything, it tightened as the hours passed, as if he was afraid that letting go would make the moment disappear, reveal it as some kind of dream he'd been having. When we finally walked back to the dorms, we didn't talk about what had happened. We didn't analyze it or dissect it or try to put it into the neat categories that our psychology textbooks would have suggested. We just walked, slower than we'd ever walked anywhere before, taking the long route through the quad where the old oak trees cast shadows that felt like shelter. Our hands stayed connected the entire way, hidden in the space between our bodies where no one else could see. It felt revolutionary and terrifying and completely natural all at once. But it was what came after that night that changed everything between us. The slow, careful transformation of our friendship into something else, something that didn't have a name but felt as essential as breathing. Felix started showing up at my door more often. Always late, always with some excuse that felt just transparent enough to maintain plausible deniability. He couldn't concentrate in his room, he'd say. His roommate was being loud. He'd forgotten his notes and needed to borrow mine. The excuses got thinner as the weeks went on, until eventually he'd just knock and wait for me to let him in, no explanation offered or required. Those late-night visits became the highlight of my days, though I was careful never to let that show. Felix would sprawl on my floor or sit on the edge of my desk chair, his restless energy somehow contained within the small space of my dorm room. We'd talk about everything except the thing that mattered most, dancing around the edges of conversations that felt loaded with meaning we weren't ready to acknowledge. He'd tell me about his hometown, a small place in Ohio where everyone knew everyone and secrets were impossible to keep. About his parents, who called every Sunday to check in and ask about his grades and whether he was meeting nice girls. About the expectations that seemed to follow him everywhere, the weight of being someone's son, someone's hope for the future. I'd listen, watching the way his hands moved when he talked, the way his eyes would dart to mine and then away again, as if he was testing how much truth I could handle. Sometimes, in the spaces between his words, I'd catch glimpses of the person he might be if he didn't have to perform all the time. Quieter, more thoughtful, vulnerable in ways that made my chest ache. Our study sessions changed too. What had once been efficient, focused work became something else entirely. We'd spread our books across my bed, or his, sitting closer than strictly necessary, our legs touching as we bent over notes and highlighted passages. The academic material became secondary to these moments of proximity, these chances to exist in each other's space without having to justify why. Felix had developed this habit of reaching for my hand during these sessions, usually when he was thinking through a particularly difficult concept or struggling with an assignment. It would start as a casual touch, his fingers brushing against mine as he pointed to something on the page, But then his hand would linger, settle, our fingers slowly intertwining as if of their own accord. He never acknowledged these moments directly, never made them into something that required discussion or explanation. But I could see what they meant to him in the way his breathing would slow, the way the tension would drain from his shoulders. Like he was finally allowed to be himself, even if only for a few stolen minutes. The rest of our social group started to notice the changes, though they interpreted them through the lens of what they expected to see. Andre and Felix, best friends who'd gotten even closer. Nothing unusual there. College friendships often intensified as people found their tribes, discovered who they wanted to become. But there were moments when I caught Sarah watching us with that knowing look she'd worn the night at Murphy's. Times when Jake would make comments about how we were joined at the hip, how we seemed to have developed our own private language of glances and half-finished sentences. Felix would stiffen during these observations, his hand pulling away from mine if we'd been touching, his laughter becoming that too-bright performance version I'd learned to recognize as armor. But later, when we were alone, he'd seek out that contact again, his fingers finding mine with a desperation that spoke of need rather than want. The library became our sanctuary during this time. We'd find tables in the back corners, away from the main flow of foot traffic, where we could sit side by side and work in comfortable silence. Felix had claimed he concentrated better when I was there, and while I suspected this had more to do with the excuse it provided for proximity than any actual academic benefit, I never questioned it. It was in one of these library sessions, 3 weeks after that first night on the steps, that Felix finally gave voice to what was happening between us. We'd been working on separate assignments, our hands clasped beneath the table where no one could see, when he'd looked up for his textbook and said, quietly enough that I had to lean closer to hear him, "I don't know how to do this." I'd known immediately what he meant. Not the homework spread before us, but this thing we'd been building in the shadows, this relationship that existed in the spaces between friendship and something more. You don't have to figure out all at once, I told him, my thumb tracing circles on the back of his hand. We can just see what happens. He nodded then, some of the tension leaving his face, and returned to his reading. But his grip on my hand had tightened, and I'd understood that we'd crossed another invisible line, acknowledged another truth we weren't quite ready to say out loud. The transformation was gradual, but undeniable. Felix was still performing for the world, still laughing too loud and deflecting attention with jokes and stories. But with me, in the quiet moments we carved out for ourselves, he was becoming something else. Someone softer, more honest, more afraid. The night Felix finally cracked open happened 3 weeks later, on a Thursday that had started like any other, but ended with both of us changed in ways we couldn't have predicted. He'd shown up at my door around 11, later than usual, without his typical excuse about needing to study or borrow notes. When I'd opened the door, he'd looked exhausted in a way that went deeper than physical tiredness. His eyes were red-rimmed, his hair disheveled like he'd been running his hands through it for hours, and there was something fragile about the way he carried himself that made me step aside without question. "Come in," I'd said, and he'd walk past me into the room like he was sleepwalking, like he was operating on autopilot while his mind worked through something too large to process. I turned off the overhead light without asking, leaving us in the softer glow of my desk lamp. Felix had always seemed more comfortable in dim lighting, as if the shadows gave him permission to be more honest than the harsh fluorescent bulbs would allow. He'd settled on the floor with his back against my bed, knees drawn up to his chest in a way that made him look younger, more vulnerable. I'd sat beside him, close enough to feel the tension radiating from his body, but far enough away that he wouldn't feel trapped. For a long time, we just sat there in silence. I'd learned not to push Felix when he got like this, had discovered that the best way to help him was to simply be present while he worked through whatever was eating at him. Sometimes he'd talk, sometimes he wouldn't, but he always seemed calmer afterward, as if my presence alone was enough to quiet whatever storms were raging in his head. But tonight felt different. There was something coiled tight inside him, something that felt dangerous and desperate and ready to break free. He'd been staring at his hands, fingers interlaced so tightly his knuckles had gone white. His breathing was uneven, shallow, the kind of rhythm that comes with trying to hold back something too big to contain. My mom called today, he'd finally said, his voice so quiet I'd had to strain to hear him. She wanted to know if I was dating anyone, if I'd met any nice girls at college. The words had hung between us, loaded with implications that neither of us was ready to fully acknowledge. Felix's relationship with his parents was complicated in ways he rarely talked about directly, but I'd gathered enough from his late-night confessions to understand the weight of their expectations. I'd waited, knowing there was more coming, knowing that this was just the beginning of whatever he needed to say. I told her no. He'd continued, his voice growing even softer. Told her I was focusing on my studies, that there would be plenty of time for that later. And she laughed and said she wasn't worried, that I'd always been popular with girls, that it was just a matter of time before I found the right one. His hands had started shaking then, so subtly I might have missed it if I hadn't been watching him so closely. I wanted to reach for him, to offer some kind of comfort, but something in his posture had told me he needed to get this out first, needed to find his way to whatever truth he was circling. The right one, he'd repeated, and there had been something bitter in his voice, something that sounded like grief. She keeps talking about the right one, about the girl who's going to make me happy, about the grandchildren she's already planning for. And I can't. He'd broken off then, pressing the heels of his palms against his eyes like he could somehow stop the tears that were threatening to fall. His shoulders had started shaking, his breathing becoming more ragged, and I'd known we were approaching the moment that had been building for months. I don't know how to be what people think I am. He'd whispered, the words coming out in a rush like they'd been trapped inside him for so long that releasing them was physically painful. I keep saying I'm straight because that's what everyone expects. That's what I'm supposed to be, but I don't. I can't. He'd looked at me then, really looked at me for the first time since he'd arrived, and I'd seen everything in his eyes that he'd been too afraid to say. The fear and the longing and the desperate need to be seen for who he really was instead of who everyone expected him to be. I don't know what else to do, he'd said, tears finally spilling over and tracking down his cheeks. I don't know how to keep pretending when being around you is the only time I feel like myself. The confession had landed between us like a physical thing, heavy and undeniable and terrifying in its honesty. I'd felt my own chest tighten with emotion, with the weight of finally hearing him acknowledge what I'd been sensing for months but had been too afraid to name. I'd reach for his hand then, slowly, giving him time to pull away if he needed to. But he hadn't pulled away. Instead, he'd grabbed onto me like I was an anchor, like I was the only thing keeping him from drowning in his own fear. You don't have to keep lying, I'd said, my voice steadier than I'd felt. Not to me. Not to yourself. It had been the permission he'd needed to finally let the walls come down completely. He turned toward me, tears streaming down his face. And for the first time since I'd known him, Felix Morrison had stopped performing. I'm scared, he'd whispered, and the honesty in those two words had broken something open in my chest. I know, I'd said, lifting our joined hands to my lips and pressing a soft kiss to his knuckles. But you don't have to be scared alone anymore. He'd broken then, really broken, collapsing against me as months of carefully controlled emotion finally found their release. And I'd held him while he cried, while he finally let himself feel everything he'd been running from for so long. In the soft light of my desk lamp, with Felix's tears soaking into my shirt and his hand gripping mine like a lifeline, I'd understood that we'd crossed a line we could never uncross. That this was the moment everything changed, not just between us, but within us. The boy who'd been so afraid of his own truth that he'd nearly suffocated under the weight of other people's expectations was finally learning how to breathe. The morning after Felix broke down in my arms, everything felt different and exactly the same all at once. I'd woken to find him gone, my bed empty except for the lingering warmth where he'd fallen asleep beside me sometime before dawn. There was no note, no message, just the faint scent of his cologne on my pillow and the memory of his whispered confession hanging in the air like smoke. I'd known, even as I'd listened to the sound of his breathing slow into sleep the night before, that morning would bring a reckoning. That Felix would wake up and remember what he'd said, what he'd admitted, and the panic would set in. The urge to take it all back, to rebuild the walls he'd spent months carefully constructing. I'd been right. When I saw him at lunch that day, surrounded by our usual group in the campus dining hall. He was performing again. The performance was different now, sharper, more desperate. His laugh was too bright, his gestures too animated, his attention focused on everyone except me. When Sarah made some joke about a professor we all disliked, Felix's response was so loud, so over the top, that even Jake looked confused. He was overcompensating, I realized, trying to prove to himself and everyone else that the boy who'd cried in my arms the night before didn't exist. That the vulnerability he'd shown me had been some kind of temporary madness, a moment of weakness that could be erased by enough noise and false bravado. He barely looked at me during the entire meal, and when he did, his eyes skittered away like he'd been burned. When I tried to catch his attention, to offer some small gesture of support, he'd turn away and launched into an elaborate story about a party he was planning to attend that weekend. A party where there would be girls, lots of girls, and wasn't that exciting? The message was clear. Whatever had happened between us the night before was over. Forgotten. A mistake that wouldn't be repeated. I wanted to be angry with him. Part of me was angry, frustrated by his retreat into familiar patterns, his refusal to acknowledge what was clearly true. But mostly I'd felt sad, watching him exhaust himself with the effort of being someone he wasn't. Watching him sacrifice pieces of himself on the altar of other people's expectations. The next few days passed in a strange kind of limbo. Felix avoided me during the day, threw himself into social activities with an almost manic energy. He flirted with girls at parties, made plans with friends who didn't know him well enough to see through his act, anything to distance himself from the truth he'd spoken in my dimly lit dorm room. But the nights were different. The nights belonged to us, whether he wanted to admit it or not. He'd show up at my door after midnight, usually just as I was getting ready for bed, looking haggard and exhausted from the day's performance. He'd mumble some excuse about needing help with an assignment or wanting to borrow a book, but we both knew what he really needed, what he couldn't get anywhere else. Those late-night visits became our secret routine. Felix would sit on my floor or sprawl across my bed, the manic energy of the day slowly draining out of him as the hours passed. We talk about safe subjects, classes, professors, anything that didn't require him to examine too closely why he kept coming back to my room when he was supposed to be avoiding me. Sometimes he'd fall asleep there, curled up on my floor, or beside me on the narrow dorm bed. I'd wake in the morning to find him gone again, as if he was a ghost who could only exist in the spaces between day and night. It went on like this for almost a week, this strange dance of approach and avoidance, intimacy and denial. I could see the toll it was taking on Felix, the way the constant performance was wearing him down. Dark circles under his eyes, a tremor in his hands when he thought no one was looking, a brittleness to his laughter that suggested he was close to breaking again. I knew it couldn't last. The contradiction was too great, the effort too exhausting. Something had to give. When it finally happened, it was on a Thursday night, exactly a week after his first breakdown. He'd appeared at my door later than usual, after 2 a.m, looking like he'd been walking for hours. His hair was damp from the rain that had been falling steadily all evening, his clothes wrinkled and disheveled. I'd opened the door without saying anything, stepped aside to let him in. He'd walked past me and stopped in the middle of the room, just stood there with his shoulders hunched and his hands clenched at his sides. "I can't do this anymore," he'd said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can't keep pretending during the day and then coming here at night, like I'm living 2 different lives." I'd closed the door quietly, turned to face him. He was looking at me now, really looking, and I could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the weight of carrying a secret that was too heavy for one person to bear alone. "If I stay," he'd continued, his voice shaking, "if I keep coming here, keep needing this. I can't keep pretending. I can't keep lying about what this means." It was a choice, I realized. Not just about us, but about who he wanted to be. About whether he was brave enough to stop running from himself. I'd walked over to him slowly, carefully, giving him every opportunity to back away, to retreat into the safety of denial. But he hadn't moved. He just watched me approach with something that looked like hope and terror in equal measure. "Then don't," I'd said simply, reaching out to touch his face, my fingers gentle against his rain-damp skin. "Don't pretend anymore." He'd leaned into the touch like he was starving for it, his eyes falling closed. And in that moment, I'd known he'd made his choice. The boy who'd been running from himself his entire life had finally decided to stop. That night, Felix didn't leave when morning came. I'd woken to find him still there beside me, his face peaceful in sleep in a way I'd rarely seen during his waking hours. The harsh lines of tension that usually marked his features had smoothed away, leaving behind someone who looked younger, more vulnerable, more authentically himself than the person he showed to the world. For a while, I just watched him sleep, afraid to move and break the spell of this moment. In the gray light of dawn filtering through my dorm room window, with Felix's breathing slow and steady beside me, everything felt suspended, poised on the edge of something new. When he'd finally stirred, his eyes opening to meet mine, there had been a moment of panic. I'd seen it flash across his face, the instinctive fear that came with remembering where he was and what he'd chosen the night before. But then something had shifted, some internal wall crumbling, and instead of pulling away, he'd moved closer. "I'm tired of running," he'd whispered, his voice still thick with sleep. "I'm tired of being afraid of who I am." Those words had settled between us like a benediction, like a promise he was making not just to me, but to himself. Felix Morrison, who had spent so many years performing straightness like it was a role he'd been hired to play, was finally ready to audition for the part of himself. We'd lain there in the growing daylight, our hands clasped beneath the thin dorm blanket, talking in voices so quiet they barely disturbed the air between us. Felix had told me about the dreams he'd been having, dreams where he didn't have to pretend, where he could hold my hand in public and no one looked twice. Dreams that had felt so real, he'd woken up disappointed to find himself back in a world where such things felt impossible. I'd shared my own fears with him then, things I'd never said out loud. How I'd been afraid that my feelings for him were one-sided, that I'd been reading meaning into moments that were just friendship to him. How I'd watched him struggle with himself for months and hadn't known how to help without making everything worse. We talked until the sounds of campus life began stirring outside my window. Students heading to early classes, the dining hall opening for breakfast, the familiar rhythm of a college morning beginning. But inside my room, time felt suspended, as if we existed in a pocket of space where only truth was allowed. Felix had been the first to acknowledge what we both knew was coming. The world outside my door hadn't changed just because we'd finally been honest with each other. There would still be friends who made assumptions, parents who asked pointed questions about girlfriends, a society that saw two men holding hands and made judgments about who we were and what we meant to each other. "I don't know how to do this," he'd said, echoing the words he'd spoken in the library weeks before. But this time, there was determination in his voice instead of despair. "I don't know how to be someone's boyfriend when I've spent so long pretending I don't want this. But I want to learn. I want to try." The word boyfriend had hung between us, weighted with possibility and promise. We'd never used that word before, never put a label on what we were becoming. But hearing Felix say it, hearing him claim that future for us, had felt like watching the sun rise after the longest night of winter. We'd spent that Saturday in my room, existing in our own private world while campus life continued around us. Felix had called in sick to his weekend job, claiming a stomach bug that would keep him indoors. I'd cancel plans with other friends, content to spend the day mapping this new territory we'd discovered together. It was during those quiet hours that Felix had finally told me about his hometown, really told me, not the sanitized version he usually shared. About growing up in a place where being different was something to be hidden, where boys who showed interest in other boys learned early to deflect and deny and disappear into themselves. About the weight of being his parents' only son, carrying their hopes and expectations like stones in his pockets. He cried again that day, but these tears were different. Not the desperate sobs of someone breaking apart, but the quieter tears of someone finally allowing themselves to grieve the parts of themselves they'd buried to survive. Mourning the time lost to fear and performance, but also celebrating the courage it had taken to finally stop running. As evening approached, We'd both known that this cocoon we'd built around ourselves couldn't last forever. Monday would come, and with it the need to navigate this new reality in the context of our existing lives. But we'd also known that something fundamental had shifted, something that couldn't be taken back or undone. When Felix had finally looked at me in the growing darkness of my room, his hand still clasped firmly in mine, he'd said the words that I knew would stay with me forever. "I don't want to let go," he'd whispered, and I'd understood that he meant more than just our joined hands. He was talking about this moment, this feeling, this version of himself he'd finally allowed to surface. "Neither do I," I'd whispered back, lifting our clasped hands to press a kiss to his knuckles. The same gesture I'd made the night he'd first broken down. Outside my window, the campus was settling into Saturday night rhythm. Students heading out to parties, couples walking hand in hand along the pathways, the eternal dance of college social life, continuing its familiar patterns. But inside my room, in the soft darkness broken only by the glow of streetlights, Felix and I had found something that felt more real than any of the performances we'd been giving. We'd found each other, finally and completely, in the simple act of holding hands and refusing to let go. The boy who had sworn he was straight, who had built his identity around denying the very thing he wanted most, was learning to want it openly. And in that wanting, in that brave and terrifying honesty, he was becoming the person he'd always been underneath the fear. In the darkness of my dorm room, with our fingers intertwined and our futures uncertain but no longer hidden from each other, Felix Morrison stopped pretending and started living.